it is on. Formula One's spring break has seen all the teams go back to their factories and work super hard. This has been nothing like the summer break, where the teams are not allowed to go to work. They have to take a holiday on the beach or in the garden somewhere. During these last few weeks since the Australian Grand Prix, every single engineer in every single Formula One team has been working flat out on developing their cars. And this spring break has changed everything going into the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Every single team has upgrades on their car, without exception, though some teams have rather more than others. And the first team to have a really significant upgrade on their car, well, has come as a bit of a surprise to everybody. It's Red Bull Racing, and the most obvious detail change on their car is a set of completely new side pod designs. Red Bull, for their own reasons, have opted to change the side pod inlet. Now, this has been quite a distinctive feature of the Red Bull family since this generation of Formula One car came in. And you can see it here. This section here is the inlet with that very distinctive lower duct, that sort of lip at the bottom of the air inlet on the side pod cooling duct. Well, that comes up around here and down like that. Well, what Red Bull have done for the car coming into Azerbaijan, they've actually completely reshaped this. This is the new version. The previous version was actually slightly narrower into the centre of the car and slightly deeper. It's a very subtle change to see, but this duct is now much skinnier along this section of the edge of the side pod. And that means Red Bull have had to change everything downstream of it. So the entire engine cover all the way along here has been completely reshaped, as has the floor underneath it. And that's absolutely crucial because the floor is, of course, what generates all of that all-important downforce. Red Bull have also had to make other changes in the area around that side pod cooling duct. The mirror support, of course, would have to change. That is a completely different support than we saw at previous Grand Prix, because the side pod is sitting in a slightly different shape, it's wider and it's narrower. That has a big aerodynamic impact on everything downstream of it. So once again, more changes on the Red Bull. They've made some minor changes as well around the rear brake ducts. They've made some changes to the front floor fences and a few other detail changes up and down the car. This has taken a lot of people by surprise because nobody really expected a big effort of upgrades from Red Bull this early in the season, because Red Bull, of course, has that penalty after breaching the cost cap in 2021. That means their wind tunnel allowance has been artificially reduced, and it was already the smallest in Formula One as a result of winning the Constructors' Championship in 2022. So Red Bull's still bringing upgrades, and that seems to be working really well for them on the very complex circuit in Azerbaijan. Well, Mercedes' bitter rivals, at least in 2021 terms, the Mercedes team, once dominant in Formula One, they too have been bringing a lot of upgrades to their car, which they've been struggling for performance a little bit all season, it's fair to say. They've changed the front suspension shrouds, they've changed some of the details around the front wings, a lot of details around the rear wing. But the bit that really caught my attention was a tiny little detail around the rear floor. It's a little bit hard to see on this screen, but let me roll it forward for you so you can just have a slightly closer look. Now, I'm not sure how Mercedes described this part underneath the rear brake duct sort of winglet elements. Now, there's a bit of design area for freedom for the teams on this section, and you can see it here. The team have just introduced a stepped section at the back of this floor, and normally they had it just closed off along here. And so this little stairway design is something that Mercedes are hoping just helps them optimize the airflow around the rear of the car. Now, don't forget, this is the exit of all of that clever aerodynamic stuff that's going on further forward on the floor. They have to bring it through. So these tiny little details all bring with them a very big effect. So Mercedes not immune from all of the upgrades, though another team at the front of the field, further forward than Mercedes, unfortunately for the team at Brackley, is Ferrari. They only bought a new rear wing, which every single team on the grid has bought a new rear wing to Baku. So Ferrari perhaps opting not to bring their upgrades on a race weekend where there's only one practice session, or perhaps those upgrades just aren't ready. A little bit of a mystery as to why Ferrari seem a little bit reluctant to bring all their new parts to the car. Perhaps the team I'm most excited about, well, looking at their upgrades, is the team that started the first few races of the season in a very distinctive pink livery is, of course, Alpine. Well, they've gone back to their traditional blue livery, which the team say weighs exactly the same as the pink livery. Well, I'm not entirely sure about that. Different pigments have different weights, but there's a huge amount of absolutely fascinating upgrades on this Anglo-French car. And who better to explain them all than the technical director, Matt Harmon, who was talking to Laura Winter in the pit lane.
Yeah, this is kind of our first big upgrade package really here at Baku. So there's some event-specific items that we bring just because of the downforce level that we require. So if I point you at the rear wing to start off with, we've got our new rear wing here. Also, while I'm here, I'd just like to shout out to Jean-Jacques. It's in memory of one of our colleagues, Alpine. Greatly missed, and it's nice that we can do that for him this weekend. We've got the new rear wing, as I say. We've also got some slightly different modifications to the suspension. So the rear mid-leg, rear lower mid-leg, we've changed some of the incidents of some of these fairings, which interact quite nicely with the new flick that we've put on the rear drum, and that's given us some great load and some good efficiency in that area. Moving a little bit further back, we've got a completely new floor on this car. So the car has changed in terms of its aerodynamic loading of the floor. We've got changes to the floor edges, the floor flank in this area here. We've moved some of the cutouts forward to change some of the distribution. And we've got some different volume on the top area of that, which means it allows us to change actually some of the details underneath on the inlet flex. And this is also now got a different outwashing effect. So, we've really changed front to back the geometry of our floor. Moving forward a little bit, we go to the track rod. We've got a new incidence of our track rod, which again is an aerodynamic development and gives us a little bit more aerodynamic efficiency. And also, lastly, but by no means least, very visual, the front wing has got a trim to the flap here, which again is all about balancing our aero loading for this event.
Absolutely fascinating stuff there from Matt Harmon. Now, I thought it's worth taking a closer look at some of those changes on the car, but before I do that, it's worth noting that Alpine's opening to the Azerbaijan Grand Prix weekend couldn't have really gone any worse. Pierre Gasly's car caught fire with some sort of transmission problem, and that's done some serious damage to the back end of that car, while his teammate Esteban Ocon, well, his car was pulled apart to inspect, and they missed out pretty much on all of their running in the only free practice session of the race weekend. So that's meant they started out on the back foot. Pretty difficult conditions going into Saturday and Sunday when the team are trying to fight back to the front. And it also means we can't really assess how effective these changes have been, but it is worth looking at them in detail, particularly on the front wing. You've got this very distinctive cutout on the front wing above the W of the sponsor's logo, above BWT. Now, that little cutout, you'll probably see lots of experts on the internet telling you it does this or it does that. In reality, unless they've got the CFD or a wind tunnel, they don't really understand what that's doing. To me, that shape looks very simple, but it could have some really complex implications for the airflow downstream of it. And I think what Alpine have done there is quite interesting, and I think it's going to get the eyes of quite a lot of other teams. It's worth looking at the standard Alpine front wing. You can see in that same section there, it's completely flat above the W of BWT. You can really see how distinctively different these two wing elements are. Just totally different concepts. Does it work? Well, Alpine don't know, we don't know, so we probably won't really find out until Miami, until they get a bit more running on the car. It's a similar story at the rear of the Alpine, and another absolutely fascinating bit of engineering design from the Anglo-French team. Have a look here. Just a little bit of a note there to Jean-Jacques Bonner, who we heard a tribute paid to by Matt Harmon earlier on, but the work of the Alpine team has not gone. He would be very proud of this work, I suspect. Now look at the leading edge of the front wing end plate. Lovely little subtle curve there, but what really fascinates me is this cutout. They've shortened the chord of the rear wing main plane quite significantly, and you can see that very clearly just here. That cutout, that recessed section, I believe is about reducing drag down the long straights in Azerbaijan. We may see something similar in Spa and Monza. Why does the forward section kick forwards ever so slightly? Well, I think this section here is defined by the regulations, those rolled tips. Now, we have seen teams playing around in this area of the car before, most notably Aston Martin with their armchair rear wing end plates, which got banned at the start of this season. They ran those on the high downforce setup last season, no more. Well, I think Alpine have actually found another little exploit in the rear wing regulations, and I think that's a really, really clever piece of work. Alpine also have a completely new floor on the car. and a lot of other detail changes. Unfortunately, a lot of those changes may have gone up in smoke in Baku. Now, staying on the theme of rear wings, I mentioned earlier that every single team on the grid, with the exception, I think, of Red Bull, has brought a completely new rear wing to Azerbaijan. These would have been completely planned in. The nature of the Azerbaijan circuit is well known. It's had a bit of resurfacing, but it's got that enormous high-speed section from the final, what is really the final corner, all the way down to the first corner, and you'll see some of the highest speeds of the year in Formula One down that section of track. But the nature of the twisty section through the city means that it's a really hard trade-off of the teams between high downforce and low drag, and some of the teams are taking very different approaches to it. So you've seen the Alpine approach here, which is quite low drag, but take a look at McLaren. They're running a much bigger rear wing. You can see how much steeper it is at the back and how much more depth there is looking at the main plane. Now, that's a much higher drag rear wing, but also a higher downforce rear wing. That's one approach, and that should help McLaren through the corners, through the city section of the track, but down the long straights, that's going to hamper them because they're going to be generating too much aerodynamic drag. And actually, it was a similar situation with Mercedes. We saw the Mercedes cars topping out on speed until they opened the DRS down that long stretch, and actually they were losing out so much in pace to some of the other cars that the other cars, for example, the Red Bull with that very powerful Honda power unit, were quicker down the straight with the DRS closed than Mercedes were with the DRS open. And we know from Mercedes power unit equipped cars like the McLaren, that's an aerodynamic feature because the McLaren was quicker down the straight than the works car as well. Identical power unit, but the McLaren was quicker, again with a big wing. But McLaren were losing out a few kph to cars like the Red Bull as well. The team that seemed to have gone the most extreme in this respect, though, I think, is Haas. Now, they seem to have given up on having much of a rear wing at all. It is still quite dished on the lower section. You can see this, and it's very Canadian Grand Prix of the 1990 style with that almost spoon-style wing. But look at the cutout they've made at the upper section of the rear wing. Now, what the teams have done here is, and you see a few teams trying techniques like this is essentially to save a bit of money on the cost cap. Rather than making a completely new wing, you can just essentially get a hacksaw out, a very expensive Formula One style hacksaw, and chop off that top section of the wing. And then that gives you a lower downforce rear wing, or a lower drag rear wing, for many of the same aspects of the downforce. And let's not forget, it's the underside of the wing that generates a lot of the force, not necessarily the top side that you see with the big sponsors logos on. So that's where Haas have gone. Aston Martin, worth taking a look at them. They've introduced a new rear wing for this Grand Prix. Again, much bigger. Compare that to the Haas. Look at the size of the top of the wing there. There's the top element, and then you can't really see the depth of the main plane, but it is still quite spooned like the Haas was. Where you compare that from the Aston Martin to what Haas have got, you can see how much more low drag Haas are going after. Is that a setup option, or is it a sign of a deficit of the Ferrari power unit? Well, we've seen Ferrari setting some pretty high top speeds all season, so it's pretty much a setup option for this Grand Prix in Azerbaijan. Of course, looking at wings isn't the only downforce generation characteristic of the cars you need to look at all year long. McLaren were meant to come to Azerbaijan with a massive upgrade to their car. In reality, the upgrade wasn't huge. It did consist of a new floor, various options of beam wing, which we'll come to, and a few other details. Well, they've made some changes around this section of the floor that shrouds the lower side impact structure. Underneath this bulge on the side of the floor, there's a little triangle of carbon fibre that looks a bit like this, and it just sits there, and there's another one that's located higher up on the car. These are identical on every single car on the grid, and they're actually manufactured by Red Bull and sold to every single team. Well, McLaren made a few detailed changes around this shape here, just for aerodynamic gain, but they can't reposition that side impact structure. That's a fixed part of the car. Changing that means a completely new monocoque, and that's unlikely in the era of the cost cap. The other big changes you'll see on the car are actually towards the rear of the car. They've got rid of a remote section of the car that ran just along here above that FAI logo, and it just sort of stuck up a little bit with some of those metal connectors you see a lot of other cars using. They've also introduced one of these little Red Bull style winglets in a cutout. Now, we saw Ferrari and Red Bull experimenting in that area of the car last year. Well, McLaren have certainly taken a look at that, decided it's a good idea, stuck it in the wind tunnel and thought, oh, that works, we'll adopt that. So that's the big change for McLaren. Is it going to do everything it's hoped to? Well, just 1 hour of practice, we simply don't know. But McLaren are looking to be recovering. But it's been a time of change for the Woking-based team. Technical director James Key has left the organisation and not been directly replaced, so there's a little bit of a new phase coming for McLaren when it comes to engineering. We'll see how that plays forward for the rest of the year. As I mentioned though, something the McLaren brought an awful lot of to this Grand Prix weekend were lower beam wings. Well, this is the back of the AlphaTauri, another team that have bought a new beam wing. It's this section here that we're looking at. These little winglets that sit underneath the main section of the rear wing, alongside the exhaust and above the diffuser. Well, these little winglets are hugely powerful aerodynamic devices, and teams are playing around with them all of the time. It's worth looking at how steep AlphaTauri's one is. Now, AlphaTauri has the highest top speed of any car so far in free practice, 344 kph set by Nick de Vries across the start-finish line. That's pretty impressive, but I think that's a nature of the Honda power unit having a huge amount of grunt. So AlphaTauri can run a bit more wing angle, generate a bit more downforce, because they can give up some of that straight line speed in favour of cornering performance, because the Honda power unit will make up for that drag with grunt and just drive through it. So a little bit of an advantage for AlphaTauri. Another team that's seen a lot of change coming, at least, Franz Tost, the team boss, has announced that he's going to be leaving to be replaced by Ferrari's Laurent Mekies. Now, I was quite sure when the former Ferrari man will be joining the Faenza-based team, but I'm sure that's all going to come out in the next few weeks. Another big change, though, at the back end of the AlphaTauri. AlphaTauri are sort of Mercedes light with the shape of their rear engine cover. You have this very distinctive humpback section, but it's not as extreme as what you see on the Mercedes. Well, for this Grand Prix, they've changed the outlet to a lower drag version that's much more tightly around, that runs much more tightly around the rear bodywork. That's just because of a higher average speed. The cooling requirements are ever so slightly different, but it also gives you a bit of an aerodynamic boost around the back end of the car. And that is just a very quick run through some of the very, very many upgrades that are on display here in Azerbaijan. The story doesn't end here though. With Azerbaijan being a sprint weekend, there's very little opportunity for teams to develop and test new parts, which means this development war and these new parts are going to go fully all out for more testing in Miami in just 1 week's time. I can't wait.